There is a sentence on the United States government's own website that I have read at least a dozen times, and every time I read it, I feel the same thing. Not outrage exactly, something quieter than that. The particular unease that comes from realizing that the story you were taught and the story that actually happened are not the same story, and that someone, somewhere, understood that distinction very well. The sentence is this: of 500 million acres distributed under the Homestead Act between 1862 and 1904, only 80 million went to homesteaders. That is the National Archives. Not a fringe website, not a conspiracy blog, not a revisionist historian with an agenda. The official archive of the United States federal government, hosted on a .gov domain, stating plainly that 84% of the largest land distribution in American history missed its stated target. I did the math. 420 million acres went somewhere other than the American families the law was written to serve. And the government has known this, documented this, and left it sitting in a footnote on a page that almost nobody reads. That number is where this investigation begins. But it is not where it ends. Because the deeper I went, the more I realized the land itself was only part of what was transferred. The other part, the part that required considerably more machinery to accomplish, was the silence that followed. And silence of that particular kind, the coordinated, institutional, multi-generational kind, does not happen by accident. It gets built, piece by piece, policy by policy. And sometimes, when the pieces are too obvious to explain away, it gets burned. Let me start with what we were taught, May 20th, 1862. Abraham Lincoln signs the Homestead Act. Any citizen or any immigrant who has declared intention of becoming a citizen can claim 160 acres of public land, work it for 5 years, make basic improvements, and it is yours. The filing fee is $18. The promise is simple enough for a child to understand. Come to America, work the land, and the land becomes yours. It is one of the founding myths of this country. And like most founding myths, it contains just enough truth to make the lie comfortable, because the law was written with holes in it. Not holes the way old laws sometimes have holes, through oversight, through the limits of legislative foresight, through the good faith failures of men trying to solve problems they had never seen before. These were architectural holes, structural, the kind that require drafting. The National Archives itself, in language that should have ended the myth permanently, describes the Homestead Act as framed so ambiguously that it seemed to invite fraud. Read that again. Seem to invite fraud. That is not a critique from the outside. That is the institution responsible for preserving the law, describing what the law was actually designed to do. Here is what that ambiguity looked like in practice. The law required homesteaders to build a 12 by 14 dwelling on their claimed land, 12 by 14. But the drafters never specified feet or inches. So speculators hired men to build structures 12 inches by 14 inches, miniature wooden boxes, set on a patch of dirt, and then they filed claims on 160 acres, legally. The General Land Office, the agency that was supposed to prevent exactly this kind of fraud, was deliberately underfunded. It could not hire enough investigators to cover the vast geography it was responsible for overseeing. And the investigators it did employ were, in the archive's own language, often susceptible to bribery. There was also a second loophole. Any homesteader could skip the 5-year residency requirement entirely by paying $1.25 per acre after only 6 months. $200, and you walked away with 160 acres you never lived on. Speculators used it constantly. File the claim, wait 6 months, pay, sell, repeat. The official explanation tells us this was simply an imperfect law operating in chaotic frontier conditions. The official explanation collapses here because imperfect laws do not write ambiguous unit specifications for construction requirements. That requires intention. That requires someone in the drafting room understanding exactly how the words would be used. This raises a simple but critical question. If the law was written to deliver land to ordinary families, why did every structural ambiguity in that law deliver land to someone else? Now, let me tell you about the 6 weeks that explain everything. Lincoln signed the Homestead Act on May 20th, 1862. 6 weeks later, on July 1st, he signed the Pacific Railroad Act. 1 day after that, July 2nd, he signed the Morrill Land Grant Act. 3 laws, 6 weeks, 43 days. Together, they redistributed more land than most wars in human history have changed hands. The Homestead Act got the headlines. It always gets the headlines. It has the story, the mythology, the frontier poetry of ordinary people claiming their piece of the American promise. But the Pacific Railroad Act and the Morrill Land Grant Act are where the actual transfer happened. The railroads received more than 175 million acres of public land between 1850 and 1871. To understand what that number means, consider this. The state of Texas covers 168 million acres. The railroads received more land than that. Not in loans, not in development agreements with conditions attached. Gifts. The Northern Pacific alone received 40 million acres. The Union Pacific received 19 million. The Southern Pacific 18 million. And what did they do with this land that was supposed to belong to the American people? They opened immigration offices in Europe, recruited families to come to America, and sold them the same land the government had given away for nothing. The Library of Congress has documented the maps these railroad companies produced, maps deliberately distorted to make their land look more fertile, more accessible, more promising than it was. Families crossed an ocean based on those maps. They bought land that was supposed to be free, and here is what stays with me. In many Western states today, the largest private landowners are still the corporate descendants of those railroad companies. The land never came back. The Morrill Land Grant Act distributed 10.7 million acres to fund universities. A Pulitzer Center investigation found that more than a quarter of those parcels were taken from the territories of over 250 indigenous nations. Cornell University alone received nearly 1 million acres drawn from 230 different tribal nations across 15 states. In fiscal year 2019, land still retained by universities generated at least $8.6 million in income. For more than a quarter of those parcels, not a single dollar was ever paid to the people who lived there first. 3 acts, 6 weeks, 1 story for the public, and 2 sets of instructions for everyone else. But land cannot be distributed from territory that is already occupied. The machinery that emptied the land is where this investigation turns, from frustrating into something I still have difficulty sitting with calmly, the Dawes Act of 1887. On its surface, it was presented as a measure to help Native Americans by granting them individual land ownership, 160 acres per family head, the same number as the Homestead Act. That parallel is not a coincidence. Everything that was not allotted to individual Native Americans was declared surplus and opened to white settlers. In 1887, Native Americans held 138 million acres. By 1934, when the policy finally ended, they held 48 million. 90 million acres, gone. 2/3 of everything remaining. Approximately 90,000 Native Americans, 2/3 of their entire population, were made landless within a single generation. Senator Henry Teller of Colorado stood on the Senate floor before the act passed and said this: "The real aim is to get at the Indian lands and open them up to settlement. The provisions for the apparent benefit of the Indians are but the pretext to get at his lands and occupy them." That statement is in the congressional record. He made it publicly, and they passed the law anyway. The mechanism was elegant in the way that certain kinds of cruelty are elegant when the design is precise enough that the outcome seems inevitable rather than chosen. After allotments were made, the land became subject to state and local property taxes once the trust period expired. Most allottees had no cash income and no experience with the tax system that had been imposed on them. They could not pay. The land went to tax auction. White buyers were waiting. The Dawes Act also created something called checkerboarding. Native parcels were fragmented and scattered, sometimes across different counties, with settler parcels filling the gaps between them. Managing land that had been deliberately fractured into a scattered patchwork across unfamiliar legal terrain was a logistical impossibility by design. And the act provided no farming equipment, no agricultural education. When asked whether allottees would receive seed or tools, Dawes himself said he did not know whether Congress would be liberal enough to provide them. The people being converted into farmers were given no means to farm. This was not an unintended consequence. This was the mechanism by which 90 million acres of treaty land became homesteads, railroad grants, and institutional holdings. But land and policy alone are not sufficient to break the chain that connects people to territory. For that, you need something else. In 1879, a United States cavalry captain named Richard Henry Pratt opened a school in Carlisle, Pennsylvania. His philosophy, stated publicly at a national conference in 1892, was 7 words: kill the Indian in him and save the man. Children as young as 5 years old were removed from their families. Their hair was cut. Their names were replaced with English names. They were forbidden from speaking their own languages. Between 1819 and 1969, the federal government operated or directly supported 408 boarding schools across 37 states. A 2022 Department of Interior investigation identified burial sites at more than 53 of those schools. The initial report documented over 500 child deaths. The government spent what amounts to $23.3 billion inflation-adjusted dollars building and maintaining this system. The timing is not incidental. The Dawes Act broke up the reservations beginning in 1887. The boarding school system was expanding through the 1880s and 1890s. The Homestead Act was delivering the processed land to new claimants. The same government, the same decades, the same communities on the receiving end of all of it simultaneously. The pattern repeats with unsettling precision. Now, let me tell you about Oklahoma. The Cherokee had already been forced from their eastern homelands on the Trail of Tears, a march on which roughly 4,000 people died. The survivors were promised their new territory as long as the grass grows and the water runs. By 1893, the government had decided it was done waiting. On September 16, 1893, a rifle shot cracked across the prairie at high noon. More than 100,000 people surged forward simultaneously. 42,000 homestead claims were staked in a single afternoon. The government had purchased the land from the Cherokee for approximately $1.40 per acre after eliminating their cattle grazing leases by presidential proclamation. Decades later, the Indian Claims Commission ruled that the sale had been conducted under duress and that the land had been undervalued. They awarded $14.7 million in compensation, but the land never came back. It never does. Each of these runs operated under the Homestead Act. Each one was the same mechanism: treaty land declared surplus, repackaged as American opportunity, distributed under the mythology of Lincoln's gift to the common man. And then we arrive at the piece I kept returning to, the piece that changed the shape of this entire investigation for me. The 1890 census was the most detailed census the United States government had ever conducted. It tracked immigration, naturalization, property ownership, family, composition, military service. It was also the first census to officially declare the American frontier closed. The census superintendent wrote that the unsettled area had been so broken by isolated settlements that there could hardly be said to be a frontier line. That declaration reshaped how America understood itself and its history. And then the census disappeared. On January 10, 1921, a fire broke out in the basement of the Commerce Department building in Washington. Approximately 25% of the 1890 census was destroyed outright. Another 50% was damaged by water and smoke. The cause was never officially determined. Investigators considered a discarded cigarette, faulty wiring, and spontaneous combustion of sawdust from the building's workshops. Here is what most people do not know. The 1890 census was the first census for which the government did not require backup copies to be filed with local offices. Every previous census had redundancy built in. The 1890 did not. One copy existed, and it was stored on pine shelving outside the fireproof vault, in the room directly adjacent to a carpenter's shop full of sawdust and wood shavings. The 1880 census was inside the vault. The 1900 census was in a separate building entirely. The 1890 census, the one documenting the single most consequential decade in the history of American land ownership, sat unprotected in the most flammable room in the building. The damaged records were moved to a warehouse. They sat there for over a decade. Then, on February 20th, 1933, Herbert Hoover laid the cornerstone for the new National Archives building, the institution specifically designed to ensure that America's historical records would never again be lost. One day later, on February 21st, Congress authorized the destruction of the surviving 1890 census records. Not preservation, not transfer. Destruction. The building created to protect American memory was christened the same week the government authorized the elimination of the decade it most needed to forget. 99.99% of the 1890 census is gone. 63 million people erased from that year. If you have ever tried to trace your family history before 1900, you have hit this wall. 1880 is there, 1900 is there, 1890, the exact decade of the Dawes allotments, the boarding school expansion, the Oklahoma land runs, the peak of the railroad land grants, the decade when 420 million acres changed hands, is the one decade you cannot see. The silence was deafening. Now, I want to be honest with you in the way I think this material demands honesty. There is a version of everything I have just described that is a story about incompetence, about ambiguous legislative drafting by men who did not fully anticipate the consequences of their words, about fraud that happens in every era of every country's history, because fraud is a feature of human nature and not of specific conspiracies, about a census fire that was genuinely an accident, a careless storage decision, and bureaucratic indifference rather than strategic elimination, about a document destruction authorization that was administrative housekeeping rather than calculated erasure. I have considered that version carefully. And then I return to the numbers. Because the numbers are not interpretations, they are the government's own accounting. 500 million acres distributed, 80 million to homesteaders, 175 million to railroads, 10 million to universities, 90 million taken from tribal nations through allotment, 408 boarding schools, one census, stored outside the vault, destroyed the week the archive opened. Those are not disconnected facts. That is a ledger. And ledgers, unlike myths, have to balance. The evidence suggests something much larger than the sum of individual failures and individual frauds and individual fires. It suggests a coherence, a direction, a series of decisions that, taken together, accomplish something that no single decision would have accomplished alone. The transfer of the largest landmass in the history of human legislation, away from the people it was publicly promised to, and toward the institutions and networks that were positioned to hold it. And what protected that transfer more than anything was a story, a beautiful story. A rifle shot at high noon, families racing across the prairie, Daniel Freeman filing the first claim at midnight. 1 in 4 Americans descended from the people who built something from nothing on land they earned. The story is not false. The farms were real. The families were real. The labor was real. But the story was all the most effective instrument of misdirection in American political history, because it made the 80 million visible and the 420 million invisible. It made the gift the headline and the machinery the footnote. Once you see it, you cannot unsee it. I keep thinking about that sentence on the National Archives page, the one I read 4 times, the one that started all of this. The American government has known for well over a century that 84% of the land went somewhere other than the people it was supposed to serve. That fact is documented. It is accessible. It is sitting on a government website right now, available to anyone with an internet connection and the patience to read past the mythology. And yet it is not in the textbooks. It is not in the founding myth. It is not in the story most Americans carry about what this land is and how we came to stand on it. That gap between what is documented and what is taught, between what the ledger says and what the story says, is not an accident of curriculum design. Someone decided what we remember. Someone decided which number to put in the headline and which number to leave in the footnote. And that decision has been renewed, generation after generation, in classrooms and history books and national mythology, with a consistency that is itself a kind of evidence. The deed to every piece of land in this country traces back through a chain of transfers. Every transfer traces back to a policy. Every policy traces back to someone's decision about who deserved to own the land and who did not. The 1890 census would have documented that chain with a completeness that no subsequent decade could provide. It covered the exact years when the most consequential transfers were happening. It was the record that would have made the ledger legible, and it is the one record that does not exist. I am not telling you what to conclude. I am asking you to sit with the shape of what I have described. The law written with holes, the 3 acts in 6 weeks, the allotments and the auctions and the boarding schools, the census stored outside the vault, the destruction authorized the week the archive opened, The 420 million acres that went somewhere, the story never mentions. Because the deepest question this investigation raises is not about the land. Land can be measured, transferred, sold, and occasionally returned. The deepest question is about the story, about who constructs it, who maintains it, and what it costs us to believe it without ever reading the footnotes. The Homestead Act was called America's greatest gift. The government's own numbers say that 84% of that gift went somewhere else, and the records that would have shown exactly where, and to whom, and at whose expense were stored in the most flammable room in the building with no backup copy and destroyed the week the institution meant to preserve them opened its doors. The investigation, as always, is just beginning. Because somewhere in the arithmetic the myth forgot to mention, the truth has been waiting for someone to do the math.